On behalf of the faculty and staff, we welcome you to tonight's speaker series. We are always excited about this program because it's a wonderful opportunity for students, alums, members of the business community to have a forum to talk about best practices, emerging trends, contemporary issues of thought in business. And so while we have a planned presentation, at the end it'll be a wonderful opportunity for Q&A. Okay, I'm very pleased. I think that all of you tonight have a copy of the book by our speaker, Deborah Perry Piscione, and did I say it right? Piscione. Okay, Piscione. And in her book, The Secrets of Silicon Valley, and it's really the subheading, what everyone else can learn from the innovative capital of the world. She writes intensely about the ecosystem created by those in Silicon Valley and the transformative effects the entrepreneurial culture has had on innovations we use every day. She explores why the unique culture of innovation and progress in Silicon Valley represents our best hope for the future and how it avoids the pitfalls of the more traditional organizational corporate culture. She is a seasoned Silicon Valley entrepreneur in digital and traditional media whose experience spans the operations, content, and e-commerce sides of digital media. By the way, 2 years from now, we're going to roll out a new program, Masters of Science in Marketing, Communications, and Digital Design, just to let you know where we're moving. So prior to her move to Silicon Valley in 2006, Deborah spent 8 years in D.C. as a staffer in the U.S. Congress and the White House, in addition to serving as a lobbyist, so I'm sure she has lots of stories just from that part of her life. Deborah is also a best-selling author, and by the way, we learned today that your book is number 5 on the nonfiction list on a number of different lists, right? So New York Times list. So this is incredibly exciting. But when not writing, she has also been and is an on-air commentator, a public speaker, guest lecturer on topics which will not surprise you about the Silicon Valley ecosystem and culture. And equally as important, how growing regional economies, how you can support regional economies through innovation, entrepreneurship, and public policy issues. So Maryland could be a wonderful case study for you. In 2012, Deborah created and co-founded Chump Genius, an educational gaming company that will teach 21st century science and math education to kids ages 8 and up. She's also the co-founder and CEO of Desha Productions, Inc., a company that owns and operates BettyConfidential.com and Alley to the Valley. I love those names. Under her leadership, Betty Confidential has become one of the most recognizable lifestyle brands on the web for women between the ages of 18 and 49. In November 2010, Deborah created Alley to the Valley. What was that book that in the 70s that, oh, it's not Valley of the Dolls, right? No, okay, Alley to the Valley. I'm dating myself here, aren't I? Okay, for the purposes of deal flow among leading women in entrepreneurship, venture capital, corporate executives, and government officials. Alley to the Valley is often described by many of the country's leading women as the most powerful networking group ever and the summer camp for smart women. Okay, Alley to the Valley. So prior to moving to Silicon Valley, Deborah spent over a decade as a television radio commentator on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, National Public Radio, and the list goes on and on. She has won numerous awards, as you might expect from this bio, including the 2009 Silicon Valley Woman Business Owner of the Year. She is a well-educated individual, receiving her graduate degree from Georgetown University and her undergraduate degree from Florida State University. She's an avid runner, outdoor enthusiast, international traveler. She lives in Silicon Valley. You seem to have mastered the whole work-life balance issue very well. Married, twin boys, a daughter, so quite a inspiring woman that we have here, please join me in welcoming Deborah to the podium. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I just want to say, anybody who's sitting on this side of the room, you may want to shift in. This is a pretty visual presentation, so if you have any problems seeing the screen, you may want to just adjust a bit. Well, it's so wonderful to be here, and it's great to be back on the East Coast, but I got to tell you how soft I've become since now living in Silicon Valley for a little less than 7 years. But I did live in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to start this evening with a video just to get you thinking, and hopefully anybody who needs to put glasses on, there's a little bit of reading that goes along with it. Welcome to Silicon Valley. So why should you listen to me? Part of it is I can speak your language because I was raised on the East Coast, so I get the culture. But in order for you to understand my perception of Silicon Valley, this very unique ecosystem and culture, you have to understand where I came from. So here's how I spent most of my time in Washington, D.C. I worked quite closely with a woman by the name of Dr. Julianne Malveaux. We spent a lot of time on air together, and we wrote a book together. And this is what we did.
On all these pet projects. Pork. 2-month fetus. Not a 2-month fetus, not a 4-week fetus. Let's be real clear. And don't talk about my mama, girl. The fact that this president has diminished this White House. You got the think tank, you got the magazine, and you're all gang up. You got all those blondes who do talk shows. Fidel Castro is a very evil. Oh, he's off as an evil president.
Julianne and I wrote this book together called Unfinished Business, and we kind of did a back and forth on the political issues facing women. And we had Soledad O'Brien write the foreword because we appeared on her show on MSNBC quite often. And so she spoke about a particular day that we were both wearing red, and it was August of 1998, 95% humidity in Washington, D.C. We showed up early on a Sunday morning, and we both must have been just revved up for some reason. And this is what Soledad O'Brien had to say from this segment when we appeared on her show. And I quote, she said, "The interview began smoothly. Each woman, dressed somewhat dramatically in bright red, was well-spoken and gracious, making a point, and then allowing the other one to respond. The genial tone lasted for about 10 seconds. Then the gloves came off, sparks started to fly. Julianne and Deborah tried to out-talk and out-debate and sometimes just plain drawn out each other on every point. It was evident how passionately they felt about their positions and crystal clear just how much they disagree. I made several futile attempts with questions, but it was as if they had forgotten they were on television. They debated ideologies, the law, matching each other point for point. My producer contemplated unplugging them, killing their mics, just so I could get a word in edgewise. For an anchor woman, it was chaos. But for our audience, it was not only great television, but an illuminating debate. So I laugh at that now because that's a me I hardly recognize. Because in Silicon Valley, things just don't operate that way. So it was just my strongest attribute in 18 years of living in Washington, D.C. was not that I worked on Capitol Hill, not that I worked in the White House, not that I served as a political commentator or became a best-selling author. It was that I had mastered the art of war. I learned how to withhold information and go after my enemy when my enemy was most vulnerable, going for the jugular. And I gotta tell you, those skills did not serve me well in Silicon Valley because it is such a uniquely, just a dichotomy from that. So, what happened one day was, if I fast forward a bit, in January of 2006, my husband came home and he was looking a little nervous and a little guilty, and we had a conversation that went like this. So, those of us that are considered a little bit of a tiger mom kind of have our kids planned, from the time before they're born. So it was a little bit of a shock for me moving from Silicon Valley because the only similarity between Washington and Silicon Valley was that it was full of type A personalities. But that's it. That's where the similarities ended. Because Silicon Valley was based on consensus and cooperation and collaboration. So I went from this environment of being indoctrinated into people asking me, who do you work for? What side of the aisle are you on? Which one are you supporting on this particular issue? To suddenly people asking me, how can I help you? What's your passion? Who do you want to meet? And I was just perplexed by this because I would just be standing in line at Starbucks, the grocery store, dropping my kids off. And I must have had this sign saying, talk to me, I'm new in town. But it was, as if people just naturally reach out on a regular basis to see how they can help, irrespective of who you are. And my first business meeting, I love to tell this story because, in button-up Washington, so I went from this, I think we're probably pretty familiar to these battles in Baltimore here, to just experiencing a very different world. So this is what YouTube looks like. This is what Google looks like. You see volleyball courts all over the place. And IDEO, which is the leading design firm in the country, is just an environment full to ignite creativity. There's no cubicles. There's, just all sorts of interesting machinery and papers and magic markers and walls to write on. So it was just a really, really different environment to get used to coming out of the political and the world of media. So this is the dish. This is where somebody asked me for the first time, I think I had been in Silicon Valley for just a couple weeks, and they said, let's get together. And this was a business meeting. And this person said to me, let's walk the dish. And I'm like, what the heck is the dish? The dish is behind Stanford University. It's Stanford land, which is why it says Stanford, California. There's a 150-foot dish, satellite dish out there that was put up there in 1966 by the US Air Force, allegedly to monitor chemical compounds in the atmosphere. But I thought, I'm a marathon runner, I'm in good shape, this is what I had driven past, so I had seen this. But let me show you what that initial incline looks like. It's not my stock portfolio, I wish it was. Here's the incline of the dish. Was this very intense climb and 3.5-mile loop, and this is how people do business. And often venture capitalists will bring prospective entrepreneurs that they're thinking about investing in, and they'll make them hike the dish, because they feel like if you take them out of the office and really, really get a sense of what they're made of, what they're passionate about, what's important to them, you really get to know that entrepreneur from a very different standpoint from just looking at P&L and anything else that you would think of in terms of traditional business financial instruments to judge whether you're going to make an investment or not. The remarkable thing is that this works. And not only does it work, but that Silicon Valley has been basically immune from any economic crisis going on around the world. We are a bubble-based economy, and to the East Coast, that is just the most horrendous words you can say. In Silicon Valley, we thrive on it because it is those disruptive technologies that are ready to come into play once the world has absorbed the technologies that Silicon Valley has created out there. And the other amazing thing is, it's a really small area. Who's been to Silicon Valley? So it's really hard to pinpoint exactly. I mean, this looks like a relatively big area, but you see San Jose at the bottom, San Francisco. Depending on where you're traveling to, it's roughly 50 miles apart. But Silicon Valley is really considered 1,500 square miles. But most of this is open land and open space, and there's no tall buildings. You've got buildings of 1, 2, 3 stories. I mean, that was quite shocking to me, for the first time traveling there. And it's often said that if you fail in Silicon Valley, there's no tall skyscraper to jump off of to your death. So you'll jump off the second story of your office building, you'll sprain your ankle, and you'll get up and start again the next day. So, but yet, Silicon Valley is responsible in this tiny area for some of the most leading companies in the world. So why should you care? Why is this important? Because Silicon Valley is responsible for the greatest innovations of the 21st century, and they are creating products that the world wants. Now try to think of naming one place that even comes close to this. The other thing is that technology used to move at a linear pace where you're putting one foot in front of the other. Now we're moving through exponential times. Things are happening much, much faster. And if you don't pay attention to the advancements of the technology that is happening in Silicon Valley will put you out of business. Look what just happened to Eastman Kodak. A multi-billion-dollar corporation now is going to be gone because they weren't paying attention to the advancements of the iPhone and the photos that they were going to take. It's just gone. So we used to live by this principle of Moore's Law, where it was considered very linear. Moore's Law was named after Gordon Moore, who started Intel, and he believed that every 2 years, the advancements in technology and the it's really just the speed of the computer processor and the microprocessor would double every 2 years, and then the cost of technology would come down by about 50%. Well, now Moore's Law is pretty much going away because the pace is moving so rapidly. And so I say it's more important to have an office in Silicon Valley than it is to have an office in New York or Washington, D.C., particularly if you have global interest as a company. So today with you, I'm going to share the Silicon Valley story, the secret sauce, because often people want to know what are the ingredients that make up the sauce, because it really is not just one ingredient. And I'm going to leave you with 5 cultural characteristics that you can adopt, because Silicon Valley is not just a place, it's not just a geographic place, it is a mindset that very much can be adopted. So, why does Silicon Valley even exist? This is what it looked like in 1916s. It was just a bunch of hay fields, broccoli fields, and orchards. So was it a carefully planned event, or was it an accident of history? And the answer is, it emerged because of decades of forward-thinking, planning, and investment. But the single most powerful force of Silicon Valley is the culture itself, because the culture is what permeates every facet of innovative success, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And the culture emerged because of the commitment of education and business leaders. So I want to touch on just 2 of those defining moments. This is Leland Jane and Leland Jane Stanford. And if anybody knows the story of Leland Stanford, he actually was an East Coaster who went west during the gold rush. And he didn't make money during the gold rush. He actually he did make money from the gold rush, but he didn't make money from panning gold. He provided miners originally with their equipment. But then Leland had the foresight. He saw this great westward expansion and knew that infrastructure was going to be critical to its growth. So he got involved in railroads, and he became a railroad baroness and made an absolute fortune. Well, he and Jane tried to conceive a child for many, many years, but had difficulties. So they finally had a child when Leland is 44 and Jane was 39, and they just adored their son. And Leland Jr. was very interested in archaeology, and he had the finest tutors, and they would take a lot of European trips. Sadly, on one particular European trip, just a few weeks before his 16th birthday, they were in Italy and he contracted typhoid fever and died. And the Stanfords were devastated, and they wanted to find a way to commemorate their son. And they looked into exploring, should we build a hospital? Should we look at a museum? They met with the president of Harvard, they went to Penn, and they decided that the best thing they could do was to make all of California's children their children. And in doing so, to provide an education. And Leland felt very strongly, in all due respect, he found a missing disconnect in the East Coast graduates that he had hired to work on railroads. He felt like what they were learning in school was not towards direct usefulness in life. And he wanted science to be the vanguard of the university, which is interesting because you'd think it would be a priority at other universities, but it wasn't. It was never a priority at any other university. So on October 1st, 1891, 555 students entered Stanford University. And does anybody know who was considered the first student? It was Herbert Hoover, by the mere fact that he had moved into the dorm. But another critical component that he wanted to address was collaboration. And this is what is so interesting, because this dates back very early on, this notion of consensus. So he hires Frederick Law Olmsted, who laid out New York's Central Park, and he wanted to keep a lot of open space, because if you've been to Stanford and you see the milieu of the place, it's absolutely spectacular, and you have the hills in the background. So he wanted to make sure everybody could see the beauty, no matter where they were. But how can you create a vision where you can bring people together in different disciplines and have them talk to one another? And this is what the concept Olmsted came up with, was to build quads. So at the time, and I honestly don't know what what they offered back then, but if you had humanities and science and English, this is what it would look like. But in the central clearing space, people would join together, they would talk, they would learn from each other. And this is really what Stanford is still committed to today. They just almost completed their science and engineering quad, which is now 12 buildings, and it's all centered around collaboration. So amazing, amazing foresight. The other thing that he did too was Leland Stanford mandated that the professors get involved in the community, they get involved in industry, they help with planning. I mean, there was very little industry at that time, but that there was almost, you were a borderless partner with industry. And then these guys came along, and they're known as the Treacherous Eight. And a lot of these guys worked at Bell Labs by the name of William Shockley. And Shockley convinced them to move west and start to work on some semiconductor activity that they were already doing at Bell Labs. And if you don't know what semiconductors are, I didn't know. But it is the foundation of all modern electronics. It's what makes electronics operate. So it turns out that William Shockley was not a very good boss. He was a micromanager. He kept changing his mind on which direction they were going to head. So this group of 8 got kind of fed up, and they said, well, we want to work on semiconductor innovation. We want to focus on this. So what they did was they joined up together and they started writing letters to various industries to see if they could be sold almost as a business unit and work for someone else. And Fairchild Camera came back and said, well, I'm not interested in making you a business unit, but I'm interested in investing in your technology. So this was considered the first venture capital investment. But even more interesting is that those guys had a disdain for East Coast hierarchy. So they moved from Shockley to Fairchild and made it completely acceptable to just spin out of one company and start another company the next day. And from Fairchild, that group of 8 there then started these companies, AMD and Intel and Atari. And nobody knows the number of companies that spun out of these companies, but it's somewhere around approximately 130. So not only is that where the popularity of the spin-off culture of Silicon Valley came into play, but they wanted people treated like family. They wanted people to be taken care of. And it didn't matter where you went on to, whether you started another entrepreneurial venture or you went to another company, you were going to take this culture with you. And what Hewlett-Packard did is even take it one step further. Anytime HP went through challenging times, they refused to lay people off. They would go to a 4-day work week, but they wanted to take care of their people. They felt like if you're going to spend this much time at work, we're going to be family, and we're going to value every single person in the process, from the janitor all the way up to the CEO, because those are the people that are responsible for the success or failure of that company. So what came out of this was this continuum of innovation that kept happening in Silicon Valley. People like to focus on the last 5 decades. I like to go all the way back to 1909, and this is in my book, when radio started. Because in the early days, it wasn't so much that everything was innovated or invented in Silicon Valley, but it was absolutely commercialized there. And you see roughly every kind of decade, maybe 2 decades, there was a new industry created. And so, we do say that it is a great place for people who constantly like to change and learn new things and evolve. It's a horrible place if you crave stability, because that's not what Silicon Valley is about at all. And then I've got an asterisk down here because now all we talk about is cloud, big data, and clean tech, but we don't know those companies that are really going to define that era. So, out of all this history became this ecosystem. And this is my definition of the ecosystem. And I do think it took an outsider getting this perspective. I would talk to, for the research of this book, I would talk to people who really were there around the 1950s, and they'd have a really hard time articulating exactly what Silicon Valley is, because to them, this was normal. To me, it was a completely foreign, different way of doing business and culture. And so Silicon Valley doesn't seem so strange for me anymore. And I did go from being an observer in Washington for 18 years and then becoming a creator and being able to build out 3 companies in 6 years. And I'm absolutely convinced had I stayed in Washington, this would have never happened. So, I'm going to just kind of quickly go through these slides here just to give you a little bit of commentary. So it's definitely a group of highly motivated people. There's no question about it. I got asked today, I spoke on Capitol Hill, and somebody said, well, what about the immigrant population? We do have a large Chinese, Asian, and Indian community who are incredibly involved in the entrepreneurial process. And of course, the question of the HB1 visas come up as well. But what's remarkable about Silicon Valley is they're only concerned with the value that you bring to the table. They're not concerned with your gender or your age, the dialect in your voice. What is it that you can teach me? What is it that can be new and disruptive? So it's a really interesting, motivated population that was very authentic in its passions and their passions. Business models. I love to talk about this because this was shocking to me. They often go out the door. It's not always about creating revenue, generating revenue first. You want that in the end game, but let's capture value. What is value? Value is, how do you amass the greatest following in the world, whether you're Facebook, Instagram, just we'll figure out a revenue model down the road. We don't know what that looks like, but we're going to take a chance right now and support you. And it's not going to look like your typical business model that we've all come to know in business school. This is Tim Draper. This is one of our leading venture capitalists. And the reason I like to characterize Tim is not only does he have a good time and not take himself too seriously, but he also is a third generational venture capitalist. He is one of our billionaires. And unlike many other places and spheres of influence where I've been, where often people may write checks to charities, there's a constant social awareness in Silicon Valley about giving back in a big way, and it's not about writing a check. So what Tim did is he started Draper University just this year. It just launched, just to solely focus on younger entrepreneurs, giving them the opportunity, and I realize this is not a popular conversation, but for those people who may not want to go down the path of a four-year university, entrepreneurship may be a better option for them. So again, it's all about, just, yes, I've made my fortune, but I'm going to give back in a big way to make sure that the next generation is better taken care of. This is the lifestyle. My husband and I would be baffled. This would be any day during the week, and you're like, what the heck do these people do for a living? Why are they not at work, when we first moved there? And then we sort of got used to it, saying, this is how life should be. Why shouldn't you get to be able to go for a bike ride during the day? And the lifestyle plays a very, very critical role in Silicon Valley's success. And I'll talk about Google in a minute. Our entrepreneurs, Stanford that I just talked about. And I love this photo of the main quad because my twin boys, who are now 8, they took a math course in the math building, which is just off to the right here, on Thursday night from 6:30 to 8:30. And every Thursday evening around 6:45, you'd see tons of these tourist buses pull up. And it's all Chinese tourists who get out with their flags, with their leader, and just taking pictures everywhere because they just want to capture this image. This is our service providers, our banks. This is Silicon Valley Bank, our law firms, our accountants. They are extraordinary how they serve on the sideline for you. Now, part of it is they're going to work with entrepreneurs and make it affordable for you to be able to do so, rather than take money that would otherwise go into maybe R&D or marketing. They may take equity in your company, but what that means is they now have a direct investment in your company and a direct investment in your success. So we have a running joke in Silicon Valley that says if you really want to get into the ecosystem really quickly, you hire Larry Sonsini at the law firm of Wilson Sonsini, who then picks up the phone and calls Kleiner Perkins, one of our lead venture capital firms, who then picks up the phone and calls KPMG. And so it just goes on and on and on, this unbelievable, I say they're like sideline cheerleaders. I've never seen anything like that. I mean, I worked in a law firm in Washington, D.C., and all we were concerned about was that billable hour and make sure we had our hours up quite high. Our meeting places, again, it is all about, there's no fanciness here. This is this is where some of our most powerful players come to eat, is at Buck's Restaurant in Woodside. And Jameis, the owner of Buck's, is a pretty famous guy, not just in Silicon Valley, but around the world, because you'll see massive amount of foreign delegations stopping and hanging out in Buck's to try to figure out, how is it that Silicon Valley works. And then you have places like the Churchill Club, which is critical. The Churchill Club was named after Winston Churchill, but it is a place of openness where people very, very freely talk about their ideas. This was so confusing to me in the beginning. I didn't understand, you'd ask people, like, what are you up to? And they tell you, this is what I'm working on. And it's like, really? Do you want to share that information? But often, these entrepreneurs will share information with their competitors just so that their competitors can proselytize their product or give it the validity or the credibility that they are seeking. So it's a really different perspective overall. But the Churchill Club is where everybody kind of comes together. And it's not a formal club. It's a very informal club. Anybody can attend whatever event they would like. But if you're interested in a particular issue, this is not only where you learn about the issue, but people will make very quick introductions to get you to the people where you need to know. This is the D School at Hasno-Plattner at Stanford. And you can't get a degree in design, but you can spend time over at the design school. So you could be in law school, you could be in humanities, you can be in medical school, but it's all about what I love, David Kelly, who founded the D School, it's all about getting your inner child back, because that's how they feel innovation is both ignited and embraced, when you can get that playfulness back on. And there's a lot of interesting elements to the D School, and as simple as I learned that design thinkers actually really like to stand. They think more clearly when they're standing. So they provide tables that are really high up just so people can stand. But it's all about what's the best way to collaborate so that you maximize creativity. And then I like to talk about the final component of the ecosystem is the bench, the competitive advantage of being raised in Silicon Valley. I interviewed for the book dozens of young people and then also individuals who were raised in Silicon Valley who became enormous successes. And those people, particularly Heidi Roizen that I looked at, actually grew up, she was so, her situation was so dire that at 12 years old she was forced to live in a motel off El Camino Avenue, which is a really, really busy street for us. And I said to her, she became one of our most successful entrepreneurs, and I said to her, how did you go from that to Stanford? And part of it is that at 12 and 13, her mother was so incapacitated that she had to pay the bills, Heidi did. She had to pay her mom's taxes. She had to take care of everything. And so it just forced her to become very entrepreneurial and very disciplined about life. And she was able to put herself through school at Stanford and decades later sold a company for $30 million. So it's just an extraordinary story. But part of it is you have this exposure to the religion and the support of Silicon Valley, which is very much based on entrepreneurship and technology. So I'm going to talk about the 5 characteristics of the Silicon Valley mindset, and then conclude with just some really interesting stories. But here's where a lot of people find this very, very unusual. Number 1, so simple, value people. It's just not that difficult. And what that is again, this dates back to the 50s with the Fairchild guys, the treacherous 8, who were really interested in the concept of flat management. They didn't feel that managers had to be gatekeepers. They needed to be team players. So you'll see a tremendous amount of flat management throughout Silicon Valley. And give good benefits. Offer people the opportunity to be able to breathe a bit. And so what Google does is it offers the 20% rule. And the 20% rule is give people a day a week to work on whatever they want to work on that has nothing to do with their job. And they felt that a lot of innovation came out of that just because people were able to freely just explore and be able to create things that had nothing to do with their job description. Netflix and a few other companies in Silicon Valley now provide unlimited vacation. And the interesting thing is, you think, well, people take time off. What Netflix found was that people actually take less time off. However, it gives people the autonomy to work from where they want to work. And what I mean by that is you may want to work by the beach. You may want to, be working in the hills and the mountains, wherever it is. You didn't have to show up in an office. And then Silicon Valley Bank this year went to an unoffice, And they found that they went from a situation of where each employee was costing them $40,000, and they dropped that cost down to $15,000. They also went paperless. But the most important part of valuing people in Silicon Valley is equity ownership in the company. I lived next door, true story, to a person who was a janitor at Google. And when Google IPO'd, he was able to afford the house right next to us. Just believe that everybody plays a part. Everybody plays a role. It doesn't matter who you are, and people should be compensated and have deferred compensation as part of that process. Number 2, value ideas. As you were just mentioning before, I mean, ideas are the prized commodity in Silicon Valley, and no idea is stupid, because who would have ever thought that Twitter would have ever taken off? When I first heard about that thing, I thought, that is just the stupidest idea. That'll never make it. Boy, was I wrong. And ideas are all best sort of percolate through the idea of collaboration. You know, it really is about transparency and not withholding information. That just doesn't happen. Take risks, accept failure, and value. Silicon Valley, they just thrive. They're just natural risk takers. It's just a very comfortable thing. And often people will say, well, do you truly, truly believe that anybody wants to accept failure? Yes, I think on a very nascent level, the idea is that through failure, you will learn. Now, I have an angel investor who invested $5 million into my company. Do I think that she actually really wants to lose $5 million? I don't. I don't believe that. And you pivot when things don't work out. You know, venture capitalists will often talk about it's not so much the idea that they're investing in, but it's the people. And do the people have the opportunity? Are they capable to pivot and change directions if things don't go as planned? Value, that's where it goes back to those business models where they often go back to out the door, and it is more about value creation than initial returns. And, you know, there's a lot of, we look for creating value long-term rather than having the immediacy of revenue generation. Number 4 is innovate. Often people think innovation is such a huge, grandiose thing. Well, that's invention. That's a whole other different realm. But what I tell people is innovate is often just letting go of old ideas, looking for more efficient ways of doing things, and provide an environment for people to be creative. And so I do talk a lot about, when I take a much deeper dive with companies that I speak at, I really go into depth about what Google does and how they do things in a way to really ignite creativity, because not everybody's meant to sit in a cubicle from 8 to 6, hunched over a computer and do their best work. The other idea that is really kind of percolated over the last 5 to 10 years in Silicon Valley is we do a push and pull in innovation. There's ideas that happen internally, but there's often more seeking of ideas externally through crowdsourcing, because that's how you have to connect with your customers. You've got to know what your customer wants. So you can think you know everything, but until you touch those points outside and really learn from what your customers want, you don't know until you're willing to take that next step and really listen to what they want. And then finally, think of yourself as a startup. Startups are lean and hungry and open, and they have absolutely no legacy to tie them down. And that's how I advise people to think of themselves that way. You know, you may have been doing something over the last 5 to 10 years that may be working just fine for you. But if it's not, then you've got to change things up. So you've got to really think of yourself as a startup in very creative ways that you could be doing different things. So here are my 5 rules again. value people, value ideas, take risk, accept failure, and value, innovate, and then think of yourself as a startup. So I want to take some questions, but I want to leave you with these two stories really quick. When I was exploring and interviewing kids that had been raised in Silicon Valley, this is Laura Deming at 8 years old, who was just absolutely obsessed with the concept of death. She just couldn't believe that things die. And so at 12 years old, Laura went into a lab at the University of California of San Francisco. And again, this is how Silicon Valley embraces its children. They recognize that there's talent, doesn't matter what age they are. And she worked with Dr. Cynthia Kenyon at the University of California at San Francisco in the genetics lab, and they actually did age-defying therapies and extended the life on worms. So at 14, she matriculated to MIT. At 17, she became a Teal Fellow. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Teal Fellows program, but one of our local venture capitalists who came out of PayPal, again about giving back, Peter Thiel, didn't want to wait around for America's best and brightest kids. So he said, I'm going to take a class of 20, I'm going to pay them $100,000 over 2 years, and they're going to carry out their passions and their work and see where they are at the end of 2 years. Well, at 18 years old, Laura started her own venture capital firm for early stage pharmaceutical companies focusing on age-defying therapies. I think she's all of 19 right now. And I love this quote. She said, "The cool thing about Silicon Valley is not though people might be skeptical of youth, they don't actually know that you're not smart enough or capable." I love that because that really captures what Silicon Valley is about. So, I want to tell you that this mindset is spreading, and I want to have you meet one other person, Jack Andraka. He's probably pretty popular around here because he's from Maryland. Well, anytime I'm having a bad day, I just watch this next video because I love Jack, and I write about him in my book, because this is the future. Again, it doesn't matter your age, your hierarchy, your experience. What is it that you can do? And let's really focus on what you can do. And so Jack, for those of you who don't know who he is, he won the Intel Science Fair for 2012 and got a nice hefty sum of $75,000 for his work of early detection in pancreatic cancer. And has everybody seen the video of Jack winning? I'm going to show it again just so everybody has a nice laugh. Whoops.
And the winner of the $75,000 2012 Gordon E. Moore Award in the category of Medicine and Health Sciences from Brown State, Jack Thomas.
It's the greatest thing of him screaming his head off with just sheer excitement and then kissing the ground of people. And
now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you the top award winners of the 2012 Intel International Science and Engineering.
so I'm happy to take questions, if anybody has any questions. And I think, are there mics for people, or just you want to? Sure. And if you could introduce yourself too, that would be terrific.
My name is Billy Martin. I'm an MBA student here in finance, the American School of Business. That's this guy. I can't remember his name or what company he's associated with, but he has a PhD in physics, and he's talking about using neural networks to understand complicated economic systems. So are they doing that type of research in Silicon Valley?
I'm sorry, what type of research?
Using neural networks to understand complicated economic systems?
Yeah, I I imagine pretty much anything is happening. I don't know specifically. I spent a lot of time over at Singularity University, which kind of looks at science and technology 5 to 10 years out. But I would imagine somebody's thought of, at least everything out there imaginable. Yes?
Do your companies have home offices, or how do you like to run your companies like Google, or how do you go about the office?
Well, we're quite a bit smaller than Google. My co-founder and I, he was born and raised in Silicon Valley and actually raised his daughter for 3 years while his wife worked in pharmaceutical trials. And so both of us felt very, very strongly. I talk about in the book, when I first moved out to Silicon Valley, I was interviewing at Google, and while I did not get the job, I went through 7 interviews. It's a very onerous process. And I really had to decide, because I had twin boys at that point who were, just 15, 18 months old, did I want to be out of an office? And I decided I didn't. I wanted to work from home. So he and I decided that we were going to both work from home, and then we opened up an office in New York and just gave our employees the flexibility of whether they wanted to show up or not. Yeah, sure.
I have a follow-up to that. My name is Sharon Piscione. I'm a business faculty from a local community college. But my question is, what are your thoughts on the CEO's change at Yahoo?
Oh, I get that question all the time. Marissa's really interesting in the sense that when she was at Google, I wish I came up with this. I think it's brilliant. I've just never captured it before. She would ask her team, what's your rhythm? And what she meant by that is, what's going to make you happy? What's going to make you feel like you're not missing out at something? And so her staff would come back to her, and she had a huge staff, but I think this was just more of her direct staff, and say, I really need to be at my daughter's soccer games every Thursday night. It's from 3 to 5, and I want to be there, and I want to be able to go to dinner with her after. And she said, great, it's going to happen. And she made sure that every Thursday night, that particular employee was gone at 2:30, and that was a non-option. And then another guy came to her and said, I never get to see my college buddies anymore. We have these dinners. I've missed the last 4. And she was like, done. You're going to go to those every single time. And in fact, we're going to help plan those for you, because Google even has a service that helps plan parties. It's just extraordinary. But I think the problem with Yahoo right now is it has to figure out the company it wants to be. Its ship of success has sailed. And while it still has a lot of cash on hand, it has to figure out what it's going to look like down the road. And the only way you can do that is by bringing people back together to talk. Because in Silicon Valley, I don't have a photo of this, but does anybody know what yurts are? Google started this. IDEO actually created it, but there are these, for lack of a better description, sort of huts that you would see like on a beach. And part of the design is to get you thinking less linear, because it's kind of circular, and it forces people to get really close to each other. And the design or the thinking behind that is, I'm now going to be touching somebody maybe that I wouldn't normally touch, somebody who has pink hair, or I wouldn't necessarily talk to them, but it's going to force me to talk to that person. And maybe I have something to learn from that person. And I think that, it was, I can't believe the controversy that created, but I do understand why she had to do that, no doubt. Yes?
I have a question specifically regarding, there's a debate. I publish news for women in business. We actually publish in 9 markets across the country. And there's a debate that there's a lot of sexism to women in technology. But the question I'm more interested about, because I work with a lot of women entrepreneurs, is a lot of Silicon Valley and the tech culture seems to be, in relationship to innovation, very focused on youth. Where does the woman who's in her 40s, possibly even her 50s, who's considering becoming an entrepreneur, fit into this ecosystem in Silicon Valley? Because is she welcomed? Is she as helped? Is she as assisted? Because here, that woman meets with a lot of drag and a lot of backlash. She's not necessarily welcomed into the tech community. because she's not young and hip and sexy. And I was just wondering if there was a difference in approach in Silicon Valley, or if they run into the same issues here, because that's a question I get all the time. I have this idea, I want to do it, but I don't even know where to go with my idea because they won't even take me seriously.
That is a fantastic question, and it's compounded in that a good friend of mine, Vivek Wadhway, who writes a lot about these issues, and he and I disagree. I mean, I don't think, again, it's all what's here in Silicon Valley. Does that mean that everybody is going to be open and inviting? Absolutely not. But the difference is that I don't need the powers that be back in Washington or Wall Street or other spheres of influence where you have to navigate this hierarchy. That doesn't exist in Silicon Valley. So if you're not nice to me over here, I'm going to go over to a different sandbox, and guess what? They're just as well connected, just as, have just as much capital and as, just as well powerful as you are. And there are thousands of those circles in Silicon Valley, and that's the difference. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, there is a degree of, I guess the perception is there is ageism, but I also know people in their 60s and now 70s who, okay, granted she was the first woman to take a company public, so she's got an incredible track record, but Sandy Kurtzwig, who made $400 million in that process, never has to work again, but decided in her 70s to start a new business. So yeah, things are really, really different. There is lots of discussion around the lack of women and the lack of minorities, specifically African Americans and Hispanics in Silicon Valley, but it's because there's a dearth of them, not because they're not welcome. It's a really different, it's a fascinating case study from a human relations standpoint, because you do have a tremendous amount of highly educated women who had opted out, but it's hard to explain, but reap just as much as the benefit because of what their spouse is doing. It's different. There's an equilibrium, I think, that exists there that I haven't seen elsewhere. Sure. Yes.
What advice can you offer for someone who isn't in the atmosphere of Silicon Valley as to how you can spur the creativity that brings about the high quality work?
So I don't know if you're talking about creativity in terms of idea creation or on the engineering programming side, but it's always great. What every success story is about is bringing people together. So it could be 3 people together. Christina Broadback, who was on the founding team of YouTube, they used to just sit around with Chad Hurley. They all went to school together, and it was just this little side project called YouTube, and it wasn't even supposed to be what it is today. It was supposed to be a dating site. That's how it initially started. And Christina talks about how they initially hung flyers around Stanford, check out this dating site called YouTube. But it always is about bringing people together, because whether it's ideas or computer programming, coding, whatever it is, you have to feed off each other. You're not going to be great. And in fact, Silicon Valley prefers companies that has multiple founders rather than just a sole founder. You don't see that very often. Mark Zuckerberg, well, no, he had co-founders as well, so I take that back. Does that help answer your question? Yes. We'll do ladies first, and then we'll come back to the professor.
Mine is just a similar question, which is probably appropriate. I work for a wonderful company that detects bombs on the ground overseas using all the spectrums of the light, and they've done it. They're coming from a government contractor, very conservative, that entrenched. A lot of us from New England, and they're doing a great job with the collaboration. They have an open door policy, so it's interesting. A lot of the culture of Silicon Valley is kind of bled in. But my question is the same: how can I be an agent of change? Say I went to my vice president of operations and said, "Hey, I went to this great talk and I'm reading this great book. Wonderful woman, very open. I almost don't even know where to begin."
You mean in terms of being able to be part of that process more so?
Generate collaboration to, and I need to read your book so I can find here to really explore the 4 or 5 points that you had, but to bring those into my business.
Well, part of it, again, I still keep very close contact with friends on the East Coast, and it just fascinates me, particularly in New York, how they can still get away with what they get away with. And people live in fear, like they're not going to have a job tomorrow. And guess what? You don't want this job? There's 100,000 other people waiting for it. I mean, why is that value? I mean, how does that describe value? And so some of it is just so simplistic, but you really do have to change hearts and minds. And one of the things that I'm going to explore in a future book is taking a much deeper dive into how Silicon Valley companies operate. And one of the things that John Chambers did, who runs Cisco, I don't know if everybody knows what Cisco is, but it's network routers for your computers. But I thought this was just remarkable because he created these internal councils where it doesn't matter if it's your admin or your marketing person or the general counsel. He created lots and lots of councils, internal councils, so that they can collaborate and talk. But it's not based on hierarchy or seniority. It's giving everybody a voice, because you know what? That administrative assistant knows, different processes much better than you do. So you better listen if this particular person has an idea how to make things more efficient. Yes. Oh, nope, I'm right here.
My name is Mike Larry, and I have a question based on the fact that you know the East Coast and the West Coast, and based on the fact that you probably know how universities operate in terms of being a fairly structured environment. How can a new program in innovation management technology transfer benefit from the ideas that you have from Silicon Valley? What can we bring into a program like that on the East Coast? Everything you said about it is correct.
So what Stanford does, and I understand a lot of universities have now adopted, is not just connectivity between the professors, but also the students and industry, local industry, giving them those experiences, which I would imagine you do. But Stanford also allows its faculty to consult. And I know a lot of other universities do that now, but Stanford started this process. And also, I think a critical component as well is their licensing department. I mean, they lay claim to over 6,000 companies that have come out of Stanford, and they define that whether the company was created there or they got involved in some of the intellectual property or the business plan just happened to be written there. But the story about Google is fascinating, and it relates back to your question, because Larry Page never had this vision to create this company. He wanted to just code this algorithm and sell it to one of the other search engines. Stanford's licensing department not only helped him get the papers on the IP for it, but brought him around to meetings, set up meetings to meet with, I think there were 6 or 8 search engines back then, and none of them happened to be interested. And that's why Google got founded, because it was never licensed. And so it is this direct, I call it a borderless partner with industry, but recognizing that, it's not students here and professors here. That was remarkable to me, how much professors at Stanford and faculty value the value that their students bring to the table. I made one remark like, oh, they're just a kid, what would they know? And this member of the faculty just about took my head off for what he thought was a very condescending comment. So again, it's not that this person is 20 years old. It was, this person happens to be brilliant in this type of coding, and you need to learn from this person. So that door is always open. I interviewed a couple Stanford students who said no one ever said no to him when he requested meeting time or brainstorming. The idea is, and I write about it in the book, if you have an idea and you talk to your advisor about it, the expectation is that advisor is going to introduce you to 5 other people that student needs to know. There was the man in the blue, yes.
Do you think the culture of Silicon Valley is replicable, that you could replicate what you see here? Because I know a lot of countries, a lot of organizations can try.
No. And part of it, quite honestly, is the weather. I say in the book that Israel is the closest thing. There's some interesting things going up in Chile. China, forget it. I mean, China's idea of Silicon Valley is you stick a tech park next to a research university. That's not what it's about. There's a lot to be said for living in beautiful weather. And growing up on the East Coast, I get it. It's like, why does, I talk about, it's my uncle who also was an East Coast transplant. I write in the book, I say, he said to me, it's a really expensive membership to the country club because it is so cost prohibitive to live out there, and you live in this dilapidated housing that should really be torn down. But, that's really what it is. It's that you're paying for this lifestyle, and this lifestyle is transcending into the workplace. So Google, you want to go get a cappuccino and a massage, and by the way, get your teeth cleaned and your oil changed, and I think I'll play a round of bowling and ice skating and yoga classes. Sure, I'll see you back here in a couple hours. That's hard to, in a place particularly like New York that wants to control everything and micromanage, and I have friends who just feel so demoralized at this point because of what's been going on there since 2008 and prior. Yes?
My first career job, I worked for an armed Congress, and had the good fortune to be sent to Menlo Park at the Stanford Research Institute.
Yes.
It's late 1970s, but then with the sandals, the shorts, the t-shirt were the logo, if you will, and great thinking went on there, but the environment was, we were working out in trailers and old World War II portable buildings. But what would you say is a transformative event that really got the eco-culture of the outdoor lifestyle, the cappuccino?
Well, I say that these guys back in the 50s started it, and it really was, you are going to treat people well, and you are going to value ideas, but Google just adopted it and massively expanded it. And what's so remarkable to me is there are so many cultural distinctions of individuals coming from other countries, but somehow everybody knows these unspoken rules. I mean, you wouldn't think of meeting with someone and not say, how can I help you? And I was over at C-SPAN earlier because I did a segment for them, and they said, we're thinking about going to Silicon Valley, and we want to sit down at Singularity University, and we want to meet with these people at Stanford. And I go, just let me know. How can I help you? And they're like, really? You'd get us in the door? And it's like, yeah, that's just what you do. It's almost like it's what used to be Southern charm, but it's this recognition that no matter how successful, how wealthy you are or not, this is just how we look out for each other. I really kind of felt like I was living in this land of Ozzie and Harriet, but in, a technology boom. I mean, it was just really an unusual environment.
I think to pick up on that, and you've helped me think through this, the culture of failure in Silicon Valley is very different than on the East Coast. Here it's stigmatized.
Yeah.
Not that you celebrate failure, but people are not stigmatized because there's lots of experimentation, risk-oriented. Can you comment a little bit? I mean, that, to me, in my observation, a couple of decades of back and forth, it's always been a mystery, and I don't know how you transport that elsewhere.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it is considered experimentation. And some experiments, I love the story of Larry Cincini, who was the partner at the law firm I was referring to. He talks about when he was helping Google before their IPO put their prospectus together. Larry Page and Sergey felt very, very, emphatic that right there in the prospectus, they were going to write, we're going to invest in a lot of things. Some of it's going to be our own technology, some of it's going to be acquisitions, and guess what? Most of it's going to fail. But you either join us on this journey or you don't. This is not a Silicon Valley-based company, but I think the case of IBM, when they recognized the handwriting on the wall that they were not going to survive as a hardware company, and what the CEO did was, I understand he gave about 150 talks around all of IBM's global offices and said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go from hardware to consulting. And you either got to be on this journey with me, or this is not the company for you. And sometimes it is just setting the expectations, but that leadership at the top, it's got to be a top-down approach. There's no question about it. Do we have time for one more, or just, yes?
Do you have any successful stories on minorities that made it or had a successful company on the civil side?
Oh, I don't even know where to begin. Actually, many of our success stories are immigrants coming, you know, and the interesting thing, particularly about the Indian community, is when they first started coming to Silicon Valley in the 1970s, because again, there was an engineer shortage. And many of them would just go to work for these companies, and but really had entrepreneurial interest on their own. And Cal Recchi, who was the first Indian to take a company public, could not raise venture capital. And so what he did was he was talking with some of his other Indian friends. They pulled as much money as they possibly could together, and they said, this will never happen again, and we're going to create this organization called TIE, the Indus Entrepreneur. And it's not just going to be for the Indian community, it's for everybody. But we need to support our community and other immigrant populations as well. And it's just a remarkable case study, again, where anybody is welcome. You may have to prove yourself. You know, I think often as a woman or a minority, you have to prove yourself just slightly more. But there are lots of success stories of, you know, individuals, minorities, and immigrants who have hit it big, very big. Any more questions? Last one.
Do you feel that the East Coast culture that has driven people away has kind of created that culture there? And does one have to exist to feed the other?
Well, you know, I was on a panel the other day, and I was on with some Silicon Valley venture capitalists, and I said the difference is, you know, again, my experience is mostly Washington. When you're indoctrinated into a culture that thrives on power and success and hierarchy, it's very difficult to get ahead. It's very difficult to move that needle forward. And this one venture capitalist turned to me and he said, "You don't think people are after power here?" And I said, the difference is, in Washington, you have to navigate with those people in mind. You have to be able, at some point you're gonna deal with them, circumvent them, you know, at some point it's gonna happen. But in Silicon Valley, as I was just explaining earlier, there's lots of successful ecosystems to enter. You don't have to be with the guys who founded PayPal or the Google boys, or there's lots of different opportunities to enter the ecosystem. But the East Coast, because part of it is we just didn't get hit with that economic crisis like the rest of the world did. And I get the exhaustion that comes around. I mean, we would almost forget, yes, our housing market maybe got impacted by 5% decline, and now it's way back up again. People were losing their jobs, but very minimally, and it was mostly because these technology companies were recognizing the shortage of sales that were happening in the software industry. But my point to that is, when you go through a financial crisis of 2008 and not knowing who to trust, that in itself can be an exercise of futility and exhaustion that comes with that just deprives you of that energy. So it is going to be tough. I get asked a lot about what Michael Bloomberg's doing in New York. Somebody's got to start the conversation. Somebody has to put the stake in the ground, but I'm a little suspect whether New York Silicon Alley can really be able to successfully replicate what Silicon Valley has. So anyway, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, as always. These are great conversations, and this has been part of a series focusing on innovation and entrepreneurship. And for some of you who haven't been to some of our other events, another interesting book for you to read would be Startup Nation, which is basically how Israel has succeeded so well in terms of venture capital and innovation and technology. And what we're striving to do in Baltimore and in Maryland is, I think we've all learned that you can never really duplicate another success. You have to create your own. And exploring best practices, and when you look at some of the interesting startups, with Betamore, and I don't want to just identify Betamore, but there's a lot of creative energies going on in the local marketplace to help entrepreneurs. There's organizations like Co-Founders, and many of the ideas that were started in Stanford have come here. We have individuals who have been in Silicon Valley and have come back here to help feed the innovation cycle here. So I would encourage you, if you're not even on the fringes of these communities, it's a very welcoming community, and we could help you make the connections and know where to go to breakfast and who to have lunch with, because it is that same collaborative landscape that is really emerging here. And I love the concept of collaborations, and we've been, for the past year, going through a redesign in our MBA and getting ready to roll out a new MBA. And one of the competencies that we're focusing on is collaborations. And we know that we're in organizations, it's about teams, but how do we teach individuals to collaborate across networks? And that comment that you raised about being a woman and affecting change, a book that I would like to recommend, which is another bestseller, is Lean In. And it's not just for women, it's also, I think, a wonderful read for minorities, because there are issues that certain populations have to deal with, and it's for the women in the audience, a good read for all of you, but for women in the audience, I think the Lean In is a must read for a woman professional and learning to navigate the corporate hierarchy, and particularly traditional hierarchies. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be sure to let you know of our next series, and this has really been enlightening. Thank you.